Well, welcome folks to our event sponsored by the New York Society for General Semantics. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lance Strate. Let's hear more of that. All right. In addition to my day job as a professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University, I'm also the president of the Institute of General Semantics and past president of the New York Society for General Semantics. So I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event. The New York Society for General Semantics puts on these events here at the Players and also co-sponsors other events, and we don't charge anything for our events. You've all been freeloading, I see,
Thank you.
with our drinks and our cheese and crackers, and I hope you're enjoying yourselves. We don't ask anything in return, but we do encourage you to become members of the Institute of General Semantics, which for very reasonable price of $50 for regular membership and $25 for a student membership entitles you to a subscription to Etc., the quarterly journal that we publish with Tom Gencarelli, who just showed up as the editor. And if you're interested in publishing in the journal, then you might want to talk to him afterwards. We also hold our annual Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture, which includes a dinner and a symposium that follows, and that is held downstairs in the large dining room downstairs. This year it's going to be at September 20th, and the Korzybski Lecture will be presented by Marianne Wolf, an expert in neuroscience and education, talking about literacy and its effect on brain structure and function. And these are always great events. That comes, with the membership in the IGS, you're entitled to attend that lecture and dinner, and even bring a guest. So that alone is more than worth the price of membership.
Here, here.
The journal is more than worth the price of membership.
Here, here.
We also, with membership, you get discounts on the books that we publish, as well as exclusive offers on, exclusive access to our the members only part of the IGS website, and discounts on the course. We offer courses. We've been starting to do that both in person and online. So we do encourage that, and otherwise we welcome you to join us for our future events. And I'll note that May 1st, the IGS will be hosting a film screening downstairs with a film about education, and that was done by Robert Albrecht. Some of you know him as he's actually the current president of the Media Ecology Association. And and that's going to be a great event on May 1st, and that also is going to be free of charge. Again, we welcome you to stay in touch, and especially to become members of the Institute. For tonight, though,
finally.
Talk about an ingrate. Well, I'm pleased to welcome an old friend and continual colleague, someone that I hired when I was chair at Fordham University.
Good job.
I was able to fool these.
Good choice.
We're going to do a comedy act, by the way, in the next month. We'll announce that also.
I've never lived it down, but be that as it may, I'm very pleased to welcome back, because Paul has been with us before here at the New York Society for various panel discussions that we do. By the way, we do panel discussions, we do poetry readings, we've done a lot of different things, including a concert last month with Michelle Schacht, who's here, and Paul's and Tom Gencarelli's band Blue Ray. So, but we do a lot of interesting stuff. But this time we're glad to welcome Paul back, and Paul, of course, is professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University, and his science fiction novels include The Silk Code, which is the winner of the Locus Award for Best Science Fiction Novel of 1999, The Consciousness Plague, The Pixel Eye, Borrowed Tides, The Plot to Save Socrates, Unburning Alexandria, Chronica, and now It's Real Life. His novelette, The Chronology Protection Case, was made into a short film, which is on Amazon Prime Video for some reason. His novelette, Robinkin's Out, well, they need content. His novelette, Robinson Calculator, was published in the Robots Through the Ages anthology in July 2023. He was president of the Science Fiction Writers of America from 1998 to 2001. And his nonfiction books include The Soft Edge, Digital McLuhan, and New Media, and they've been translated into 15 languages. You don't mention the space book that we do.
I know, because it wasn't that important.
It was.
I know.
What was the name of it again?
It's called Touching the Face of the Cosmos, on the intersection of space travel and religion. If you want, I can do a reading from that.
After party.
Well, we've been there, done that. So he's also a recording artist. His 1972 album, Twice Upon a Rhyme, was reissued in Japan and Korea in 2008, and in the UK in 2010. His first new album since 1972, Welcome Up, Songs of Space and Time, was released by Old Bear Records and Light in the Attic Records in 2020. And of course, tonight we're here to celebrate the book launch, the publication of a brand new novel by Paul Levinson. It's Real Life, an Alternate History of the Beatles, which is an expansion of the short story of the same name, which won the Media Ecology Association's Mary Shelley Award for Outstanding Fiction in 2023. I wonder how that happened.
I don't know.
And was made into a radio play.
Yeah.
So without further ado, I'll turn you over to Paul.
That was a great introduction. It took a little time to get there. That was fabulous. Let's get right into it. That's Real Life from the Beatles' 1985 Go and Come LP. And I'm Pete Fornatel on WFUV's July 4th, 1996 week-long celebration. Pete sighed with a mix of all kinds of deep emotions as the song played. Every time he played that song, every time he heard it, he felt like crying, and his eyes burned right now. The song was not only heart-tugging and beautiful, but profoundly unsettling to Pete. And he felt that he was somehow connected to it. The Beatles, in 1996, were close to breaking up. Lennon had made that clear in his long interview with Pete's colleague, disc jockey Dennis Elsis, earlier this year. McCartney had too, in what he had said about his solo song, My Brave Face, co-written and co-performed with Elvis Costello. That was the first time any Beatle had done that with a non-Beatle. But no, that was not the reason. Pete felt this unspeakable sense of foreboding about the Beatles and about John Lennon in particular. Pete put another piece of vinyl on the turntable. That was still his favorite way of playing music. Here's one of my old-time favorites, George's All Things Must Pass from the Beatles' 1974 Band on the Run LP. They brought in Nicky Hopkins to play piano on that one. Pete hoped the song might make his foreboding pass. It only made it worse. He looked at the stained analog clock on the wall. He had just 12 minutes left of his show. Maybe he'd take a walk in the tunnels below Keating Hall. That had always cleared his mind when he first started walking there, back when he was a student here at Fordham University in the 1960s. He found it cleared his mind now too, since he'd returned to Fordham and WFUV about 2 years ago. No one knew exactly when or why those tunnels had been built. Likely near the end of the 19th century in one of Fordham's many expansions, so students could go from one building to another without getting frostbitten in winter or drenched in the spring. There was a rumor that Edgar Allan Poe had something to do with constructing them, and that one of the tunnels went straight to his home up on Kingsbridge Road. Not likely, but who knew? Pete's Post Cottage on Kingsbridge off the Grand Concourse, well, that was definitely real. As was, come to think of it, Lennon's great line in I Am the Walrus about kicking Edgar Allan Poe. Pete smiled. One of his all-time favorite Beatles A-sides, and the geniuses at the BBC had banned it because of the knickers line. But who would kick Poe? Everyone Pete knew loved him and his work. Things must have been different over in England back in the 1960s, or at least different in John Lennon's perception. On this Tuesday in the Bronx, after July 4th in the 1990s, the tunnels were even danker than usual. But Pete didn't mind. He was kindly disposed to the fungus or lichen or whatever it was on those walls. The dankness was part of their charm. There were all kinds of stories about what existed or what could be done in those tunnels, ranging from ghosts to teleportation portals to Pete's favorite. He'd encountered it in a science fiction story written by a professor in the communications department even before Pete had been here as a student. Yeah, The Last Train to Margaretville, about how the tunnels actually were conduits to alternate realities. Margaretville. He'd had a delicious dinner there at some academic conference just last year at the Binnacle, a restaurant on Main Street that sat above a bubbling brook. Pete felt vaguely relieved. It wasn't just the recollection of the schnitzel. The very thought of alternate realities made him feel better. Maybe he could get to an alternate reality where he wasn't plagued by this inchoate feeling of dread about John Lennon. He'd been thinking so hard, he walked a little further than he'd intended in the tunnels. He didn't recall seeing that thick wooden door that now lay straight ahead of him. There were plenty of them here and there in the tunnels, but they were always locked. He once asked a maintenance guy in Keating what was behind them. Cleaning supplies, the maintenance guy said. This one wasn't locked. Maybe someone on the maintenance crew had left it open accidentally or because he was in the middle of a job. Pete couldn't resist. He opened the door. All he saw in front of him was another tunnel with no sign of cleaning supplies. He walked through the door, and in the tunnel beyond for a few minutes, he saw nothing unusual, the same mottled walls and the occasional door bolted shut. He looked at his analog watch. He looked at his analog timepiece. He'd been in the tunnels too long and realized he was now in danger of coming late to his appointment with the WNET people in Manhattan in just an hour. The meeting was very important. They wanted Pete to host a special on the Beach Boys, another one of his favorite groups, and their new single had Dennis Wilson singing lead for the first time in years. He looked back on where he'd been walking. He needed to find a faster way out of here so he could catch either Conrail or Fordham's Ram van downtown, depending upon where he was able to exit. He knew there was more than one exit. He'd used multiple exits since he'd started walking here in the 1960s, and there was an exit, a different kind of door, not bolted. With any luck, there would be a steep flight of stairs upward on the other side. And there was. Pete sprinted up the stairs so fast his legs hurt. He opened the door to a soft ring. It wasn't bad. He squinted and saw he was on the west end of the campus. Okay, it would be Conrail to Manhattan. He had no idea what its schedule was, but the trains did run pretty often. He walked quickly past Duane Library towards the train station. He loved that old library with its winding steps to shelves overcrowded with books. He heard a train in the distance and he quickened his pace. It was definitely coming from the north. It would be very close, but he was good at catching an arriving train. He knew he could pay on board. Pete dashed past the ticket booth, nearly collided with an elderly woman. "Excuse me, ma'am," and apologized over his shoulder. He rushed down the stairs to the tracks just as the train pulled into the station. He walked through the open doors and smiled. He always enjoyed these last-minute boardings. It was more fun than arriving early and standing on the platform. He sat on one of the worn cloth seats and awaited the conductor. A woman soon approached with a tight uniform and a book of tickets. "Grand Central Terminal," he told her. She nodded. $5. Pete gave her a $5 bill and she reciprocated with a ticket stub. As she walked away, Pete noticed that it said Metro North on the back of her uniform. He hadn't seen that before. It usually just said Conrail. The train arrived at Grand Central about 20 minutes later. A group of buskers caught his ear and eye. 3 young women were singing "Yes It Is." "Please don't wear red tonight." It was one of Pete's most beloved Beatles songs. He looked at his watch. He'd made good time on the train and had a few minutes to spare. He took another $5 bill from his wallet and placed it in the open guitar case, which already had plenty of bills and coins. The women finished singing the song with the word "true" in lovely, lilting harmony. "Thank you," the lead singer with long black hair said to him. The other 2 were blonde. And the 3 reminded Pete of the Bangles. "You were wonderful, just wonderful," Pete said. "Do you do requests?" The lead singer nodded. "How about real life?" Pete asked. She scrunched her face. "You mean real love? I think I read in Rolling Stone that Real Life was the original name of the song." Pete shook his head and laughed. He'd read every issue of Rolling Stone, and he'd never seen any article or review or interview that said anything like that. He certainly didn't want to insult these singers and tell them, "I'm Pete Fornatell, and I no doubt know much more than you do about the Beatles." So instead he said, "Okay, could you play me that song?" The women nodded and began singing. It was beautiful, exactly the same as real life, except they were singing real love. It's real love. Thank you, he said when they were finished, and impulsively reached for his wallet. All he had was a $10 bill and a $20 bill. He put the 10 in the open guitar case with a flourish. You deserve it. Isn't that Ronald Reagan? One of the blonde singers asked. Pete nodded. When did they change the guy in the money? The other singer asked. Alexander Hamilton's on my $10 bill. Pete didn't know what to say. He looked at his watch. If he stayed here much longer, he'd be late for his appointment. He pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and called one of the WNET people he was supposed to meet. The phone rang and rang and rang with no answer and no voicemail. Put the phone back in his pocket. He didn't really care about the pictures on the money. He cared about NET, but what he cared most about were the Beatles. Can you tell me all you know about that song? He asked gently. The women looked at each other. The lead singer looked up at him and considered. You gave us $5 of real money. Even if the $10 bill isn't real, I guess your 5 is worth a few minutes of conversation. Thank you, Pete said. When did you last hear that song? I saw the video on MTV the other night, one of the singers said. It was very moving. I don't think I've seen that, Pete responded. What did you find moving about it? I mean, you know, with Lennon and all, it was very, very emotional, she said. Yeah, Pete replied. John always has a voice that pulls at your heart. And the singer continued. You know, seeing him come back to life on that video, on that song, it was really something, the lead singer said, with something like tears in her eyes. Pete opened his mouth to say something, but stopped. This was getting crazier by the moment. What do you mean, come back to life? He finally asked, slowly. Had something happened to John Lennon that somehow he hadn't heard about? Impossible. Impossible. All 3 women looked at him with expressions ranging from suspicious to amazed. I think you can hear those singers right now. You know he was assassinated in 1980, right? The woman with long black hair finally asked him in a soft and husky voice. No, I don't, Pete thought. Look, thank you. You have a lot of talent, and apologies for the interruption, was all that Pete could manage. He opened his wallet for the 20, but thought the better of it. He might need it for other things, so he reached in his pocket and found 2 quarters. Thanks, he said again, and put them in the guitar case. They had George Washington on them. They're right, they're real, aren't they? Pete asked. The singers looked at each other and nodded. Thanks again, Pete said, and he hurried away. There had to be a bookstore with an encyclopedia in or near Grand Central. He found a Barnes & Noble on 5th Avenue. He walked as quickly and inconspicuously as he could to the reference book section. He picked up the B volume in a World Book Encyclopedia and frantically turned to the Beatles. Oh my God. He felt sick to his stomach. Those singers were right. It said here that John Lennon had been shot to death in December 1980. He put down the volume and frantically picked up another encyclopedia and opened it to the Beatles, and then another, and then another. God Almighty, same thing, same thing. What the hell was going on? Pete half sat, half collapsed on a plush chair and wondered what to do. The air conditioning felt way too cold, he realized he'd broken out into a cold sweat. He was going crazy. He felt weak. He hoped he wasn't having a heart attack. He knew he was in no condition to see the WNET people now, even if he wanted to, which he did not. The best thing was to return to something reliable. Right, that was the ticket. Fordham University, where all of this had started. Or maybe it had started when he'd encountered the girl group who looked like the Bangles and sang like the Beatles. He wasn't sure. No, he was. This losing his mind was all a piece of when he had played real life on his show. That had unnerved him, as it always did. He walked through the tunnels. He had walked through the tunnels for some peace. He'd taken the train to Grand Central. And then this. Whatever it was not peace. He needed some caffeine, or maybe a drink. Yeah, that would calm him, but he needed a clear head. No, he needed some coffee. Thank goodness the bookstore had a coffee bar. He got up shakily, took some deep breaths to relax, and walked carefully up to the end of a short line. He ordered a coffee, jet black. He took out his wallet, took out the $20 bill, and had another jolt of anxiety. He hoped the woman behind the counter didn't think this was funny money, like the singers from Grand Central Station did about his 10 spot. If she did, he might not only be unable to pay for his coffee, how would he pay for the ticket back to Fordham? He had an American Express card at home, but he didn't like to use it. He looked at his $20 bill very carefully. Andrew Jackson was on it. He took his coffee and gave the bill to the cashier. He shut his eyes and prayed. "Here's your change, sir. Are you okay?" Pete smiled. "Yes, fine, thank you." Of course, he was not okay. Not by a long shot. But at least he'd have no problem getting back to the Bronx and maybe sorting this out. At least he hoped so. He sat at a small table and sipped. Pete eventually got up, walked, and focused as best as he could as he walked back to Grand Central. The coffee had strengthened him, but he didn't trust his legs. He kept thinking about what he had read in those encyclopedias. If this was a dream, it was one mother of a complex, detailed vision. Not only was John Lennon murdered in 1980, according to those damn encyclopedias, the Beatles had disbanded in 1970. Band on the Run was a McCartney-only album with his new band called Wings, released in 1973. Handled with Care, a huge hit for the Beatles in 1988, the biggest of the decade, was recorded and released by a supergroup that same year, consisting of George Harrison, Bob Dylan, Roy Orbison, and two guys Pete never heard of. He turned quickly to the Roy Orbison entry. He had turned quickly to the Roy Orbison entry in the first encyclopedia. It said the Big O had died in 1988. His heart had given way. All three of these encyclopedias agreed on this. Pete couldn't take any more of this. He talked to Roy Orbison just 2 weeks ago, in May 1996. And the Big O was fine. They talked about a new TV series David Lynch had asked Roy to write a new song for. Pete couldn't bear to think about these insane encyclopedias any longer. It wasn't good for his heart or his soul. Except Pete was pretty certain he was the one who somehow had become deranged. He hoped he'd be able to talk a little more to those buskers, but they were gone. Pete felt like that Frank Converse character in Coronet Blue. He watched every episode of that series in the 1960s. He had found himself during those years, realized what he was doing here on this earth, something neither the Converse character nor he himself on this uniquely harrowing day had been able to do. He stepped up to the counter in Grand Central Terminal and bought a ticket to Fordham. The next train would be leaving in 15 minutes. He looked around the station and realized that there was no sign anywhere in the entire station of Conrail. It was all Metro North, the name he had seen on the conductor's back on the way down here. He boarded the train, sat in a comfortable seat, and closed his eyes. He hoped that this train with the new name would bring him back to Fordham University, to the Fordham University that he knew. The last thing he thought before he fell asleep is maybe he should try to warn John Lennon not to go back to the Dakota on that fateful day. I'd read about in the encyclopedias, he had the number of Lennon's publicists. Each member of the Beatles had their own publicist. No. Pete realized he wasn't thinking clearly. That horrible murder of Lennon in 1980 and everything Pete had seen in Manhattan today said Pete, was still here in 1996. This was some kind of sick trick of alternate history that he'd walked into, not time travel. He needed to get these genres straight in his life. He walked up to the conductor and announced the train. As the conductor announced the train was approaching the Fordham University station. Years of riding the New York City subways had given Pete a sixth sense which enabled him to wake up from even a deep sleep on his train approaching his station. That sense had carried over to Conrail, or Metro North, or whatever this train system was now named, in this awful world in which the Beatles had split in 1970 and John Lennon had been killed in 1980. The question was, how could he get back to the world he knew? Although he had boundless curiosity about this nightmare world, or the jagged contours of this dream, whichever it was, he wanted to get back to where he'd been earlier this afternoon. That was what his soul most craved. He needed desperately to get back there. Get back to where you once belonged. And then he could consider what he'd seen and heard and read today from the relative comfort of what he had known his whole life. But how? He walked through the security at Fordham with no problem. He didn't have to show the guard his ID. She knew him personally. Pete figured the best chance he had of getting back was retracing the steps he had taken to get here. Pete laughed half to himself. Get Back was a big Beatles hit in the history Pete remembered. He hadn't checked in the encyclopedias to see if it was a big hit here. The encyclopedias. There were no doubt more of them in the Fordham Library, and as he walked back to Theobald Hall, which is where he'd emerged from the tunnels and passed by the library, he toyed with going into Duane Library and checking out some other encyclopedias. He was very tempted, but he needed to get back to where he once belonged, as McCartney might tell him if McCartney were here singing in his ear. Pete entered Theobald Hall, went to the men's room to splash some cold water on his face, and proceeded to the staircase to the basement and the tunnels. He had a fleeting fear that the door to the tunnels wouldn't open, but it did open just fine. He retraced his steps as best he could. He felt nothing unusual, no change in anything, but then again, he felt nothing peculiar as he'd entered this twisted world in the first place a few hours ago. And he again found this dankness reassuring. It was sensory evidence that he was in the right place. He reached Keating and was glad to see the door to its stairs was not locked either. Pete climbed the stairs up to WFUV on the top floor faster than usual. His phone made a noise. He looked at it. 3 calls had come in from the people at WNET. He called back. I ran into a problem on the train, he began. Penn Central, Jennifer, the woman on the phone, said, yeah, we heard about the broken train and hoped you were ahead of it or were coming down here another way. Yeah, Pete managed to say as he entered the FUV offices. And what exactly now was this Penn Central? Another name for Conrail? How about we reschedule for next week, Jennifer asked. Would that work for you? Sure, Pete said, barely able to think. Great, Jennifer said. I'll confirm via email unless you have a Facebook account. Email is fine, Pete said. He didn't feel like telling her he'd never heard of anything called Facebook. He ended the call and walked by the studio. Dennis Elsis was on the air. He was playing some song that was new to Pete. That was Paul McCartney, Elsis said when the song was over, singing a song from the science fiction musical he did with Isaac Asimov. Been years since I heard that. Thank you. All right, and now through, I took a walk actually down those tunnels myself last week because I wanted to try to get a piece of one of those realities that I just told you about. And you know that song that Dennis Elsis played in the story from this musical that Isaac Asimov and Paul McCartney had written. Let me just say, first of all, in writing alternate history, it's always good, I think, to make the history as close as possible to reality. And it is true that in our reality, Paul McCartney did have an idea for a musical, contacted Isaac Asimov and asked Isaac Asimov, could you just write, you know, a general scenario, you know, and then I'll convert it into a musical. Isaac Asimov never turned down an offer to write. I once got him to write a preface for one of my books, and I said to the publisher, I guess we'll pay him what, like $1,000, maybe even $2,000. The publisher said, no, offer Asimov $100. Trust me, he'll take it. And in fact, he did. So, we'll just see the truth. So anyway, Isaac Asimov did write this scenario. I have no idea what it was. He sent it to Paul McCartney, and believe it or not, McCartney didn't like it. And that's where the musical ended. It was never really written in our reality. But it was written in this reality that Pete had now walked into, a third reality. So I wanted to get you that song so I could play it for you. But I tried in the tunnels, I couldn't get anywhere, that didn't work. I did like an extensive search. And I was able to come up with an American version of the very song, which I think was the song that Dennis Elsis played at the end of what I just read you. It is like a science fiction song, and again, it's an American song. It's sung by somebody with a clearly American, even Bronx accent.
Weird.
Here it goes.
Strange.
on and that's a very pretty good song. And actually, in the radio play that Lance mentioned, that was made of actually just that complete chapter, which you can hear. Just search for Kilowatt Radio and my name, and you can hear the whole radio play. We did want to actually play that song, and we did have somebody, at least with a British accent, a guy by the name of Spencer Hannibus from London. Didn't sound quite like McCartney, because McCartney doesn't have a London accent, but a lot more like the Beatles than I certainly did. So that's like a little taste of what the radio play is. And you know, the song is about time travel, which, as Pete realizes in this first chapter, really is not what's going on here, and really might well be beyond his power to do, as he's so devoted on making sure John Lennon doesn't die in any reality. That's the way it was in the short story, but what's writing a novel for if not to make things happen that you didn't think could happen in the short story or the first chapter? So time travel does play a role in the novel. And while I'm on the subject of the novel, here's something you might find very interesting. When was the last time you were at a reading or an event where a character, an important character in the novel, was sitting right here in the audience? And I'll give you a hint, it's not Dennis Elsis.
Paul McCartney's here?
Oh,
He had to leave.
that would be great. But actually, it's somebody, you know, very talented playwright, who I first got to know back over 20 years ago. He had written a play called Acoustic Space, and he knew about Marshall McLuhan's work in acoustic space. To McLuhan, that was like one of the most important ways of understanding our world. What we go through visually is like a kind of acoustic space when certain kind of media get into a dominant position. And so this playwright by the name of Anthony Marinelli sent me a script. I thought it was a great play, and he did eventually you know, have his group perform on stage. I think made a small movie of it, and we've been in touch ever since. He constantly is winning awards in various events where people send in their plays, and his plays come out on top. Anyway, so I pulled a bunch of incredible strings, and I got Anthony Marinelli, who you'll read about in the novel. You have to be careful, you know, when you know me, because you never know when you might turn up in one of my novels or stories. This is because there's an old cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. You write best, I think, when you're writing about things that you know, rather than just making up, you know, different things. That's why a lot of my stories take place in New York City. It's because we're here in New York City. So you'll find in the novel, it's real life, a lot of characters that you may have heard of. Now you've actually met one of them, and you know, a few characters you probably don't know who they are. What I'll now be happy to do before I'm more than happy to sign some books for you, is any questions, comments, thoughts about this story that I read to you? Anyone who's interested in alternate history, which I will say, most of my science fiction has been about time travel, but not beginning with this, but this is the first novel I've had published, and I've had a bunch of short stories published. I find alternate history increasingly attractive. Maybe it's a commentary on what our real world is like now. I don't know. But I find it a very enjoyable thing to imagine how things would be different in a world that in many ways was like our world, but in some crucial way or ways was not. So anyone have any questions? Yes.
How much is Pete Fornatel's yearning for a different life for John Lennon and the Beatles, Paul Levinson's yearning for John Lennon and the
Yeah.
Beatles?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. But this is Bob Mann, who is a great podcaster, and I'm often on his show, and he used to do a show on Sirius XM radio. And again, this gets to what I said before. You write about what you best know, and I am, I don't know, I guess depending upon how you look at it, I'm glad to have made it to this age, so I guess fortunate, but at the same time I'm fortunate to have lived through some pretty horrible events, and I'm not just talking about Trump, by the way. But I, was essentially a kid when John F. Kennedy was killed. And I still haven't gotten over that and the way the world changed. And tragically, from my perspective, obviously people have been assassinated before that, but that was just the beginning of what later happened in the late 1960s to Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, not to be confused, by the way, with his son. But I have to say, the assassination of John Lennon, the killing of John Lennon, is in a class by itself. And there was something about it that was like so totally horrendous and unexpected that in many ways, that's, of all the assassinations that I've lived through, and it's really a horrible thing to even have to talk about something like that. But what happened to John Lennon is the worst. It's uniquely horrible because whatever was going on in the killer's head, I'm not even going to say his name, I don't want to give him any more publicity, it was an assassination of art. It was an assassination of music. Lennon had just completed a great album. It was released shortly after his death, and he had a lot more music in him. And this is, what his murder deprived the world of that. And so, yes, I know that Pete Fornatel felt that way, but clearly this novel is about me in the guise of Pete Fornatel, because I'm not a disc jockey. By the way, I've some disc jockeys, including Dennis Elsis, know about the novel, and they generally don't like these alternate histories about the Beatles. They weren't particularly thrilled to hear that I wrote this. They hated Yesterday. So I don't know why that's the case, but if you ever run into like a real DJ and you tell him about this book, don't be surprised if you get some kind of negative response. But I'm used to that. So, any other questions? Yes.
So you got me thinking, because with Pete's reaction to the Traveling Wilburys, maybe there's a sequel in there where like Tom Petty is pumping gas in Florida, finds out about this and goes back to actually kill John, so he has a career.
Yeah. Well, it's not impossible. But Tom Petty, by the way, is a major character in the ensuing novel. And without giving too much away, in chapter 2, what you just heard is chapter 1, Pete goes into the radio station the next day trying to calm down, and his secretary puts a call into him from Tom Petty. And his secretary loves Tom Petty. Hey, I have Tom Petty on the phone. Pete never basically heard of the guy, and then he had to talk, Tom Petty, and Petty is a little upset. He says, hey man, how come, I don't want to be too pushy, but how come you never play any of my songs? and so Pete doesn't know, what to say. So, yeah, I mean, and all of these like little alternate reality things, there's another DJ and on another radio station. This is Stony Brook's radio station, and his name is Phil Merkel, and he has a show called Captain Phil's Planet. And shortly after the short story was published, he interviewed me and on his show, And he confided in me how furious he was. He didn't care about Tom Petty, but how could I diss Jeff Lynne like that? If I was writing this, I never would have left Jeff Lynne out of it. But I think that's part of the point of alternate reality. You want to keep your reader, who knows our reality, sort of always off kilter, surprised at what's missing, surprised about what's not missing. And some things happen slightly in the future, like the Facebook business. Other things might not happen at all. Yes.
Just based on your last points, I know that this might be something that we should explore for reading the book, but do you ever describe the appearance of your character? Maybe if he looks in the mirror, do you ever do that?
That's a very good question. I usually don't talk much about the appearance of my characters. I in my work and in this novel, I talk much more about what the character is thinking of the other people he sees around him, like the conductor on the now Metro North train. So we find out about him on the train. He's looking at her, and we have some idea about what he's thinking. But no, I don't have any. There could be a case in which a character looks in the mirror because he's trying to understand something. But what we find out about Pete is what other people think of him. And let me also say, by the way, as long as I'm the subject of Pete, he was a real person, one of the sweetest people I have ever known, really. And we actually went back a pretty long way. I mean, first of all, he didn't know me, obviously, but back in the 60s, I was a big fan of his Mixed Bag show on WFUV. And one of the first things I did when I became a professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey, and I was, teaching some kind of media course. What else am I going to teach? I saw that Pete Fornatale had co-written a book. It was titled something like Television in the Age of Radio.
Radio and the Television.
Radio and the Television.
Joshua Mills.
Joshua Mills, thanks. And I remember I got an examination copy. It was a great book, and I basically ordered a bunch of copies of the book. So I knew Pete from his writing. And then, years later, after he'd come back from NEW, where he had been a disc jockey, back to WFUV, which in our reality was a little later than Pete's reality. In our reality, Pete came back like maybe 2002, 2003. Around, I guess it was 2010, 2011, as Lance mentioned in my introduction, a new edition of my 1972 album, Twice Upon a Rhyme, had been released, and actually was released in several places, and the Korean record company, which is one of the places, they wanted to know, can I put a couple of extra songs on the CD? So one of the songs I put on my CD of Twice Upon a Rhyme, the 1972 album, it wasn't If I Traveled to the Past. It was a song called Murray the K's Back in Town, which is a song I wrote about the disc jockey Murray the K. So when that album came out, I went over to FUV station and I gave Pete a copy of it. I said, hey, if you could play any music from this, that would be great. And sure enough, on his next show, he was doing like a whole segment on songs about DJs, and he played Murray the K's Back in Town. And Lance will remember this. I'm going to put Lance in another novel. I feel bad. He does figure in many things. But in the conference, Lance, that you organized about McLuhan, so I guess that would have been maybe 2011, on the McLuhan's 100th at Lincoln Center.
That's the second one then.
Okay, the second one, right, well, the first one is where we met in the first place. That's right. But at that conference in 2011, that was the last time I saw Pete Fornatale. We talked. It was great to see him at the conference. And then, tragically, he died at a way too young age, a year or two after that. And so, when I was writing this book, this is my, in effect, send-off to Pete Fornatale. I want the world to know about him and more about him. And, if I would have written the thing maybe with Pete Fornatale, and then in addition to Anthony Marinelli, I could have introduced Pete Fornatale from the audience.
But maybe, Paul, since you bring that up, since Pete was a student of Marshall McLuhan when he was at Fordham, and maybe Terry remembers him as well. But does Marshall McLuhan enter into your novel?
Let me just think. Marshall McLuhan enters into a lot of my novels. I can do a search, not in the book, unfortunately, because there's no index in it. But I'll when I have a chance, I'll just hold on a second. I will pull up the novel here, and I'll search on McLuhan.
What are you trying to find?
Well, I'm trying to find whether Marshall McLuhan appears in my novel. So let's just see. It'll just take a minute. Hold on a second. This is like the magic.
I put $5 on his
Why,
name.
you nobody passed away.
Yeah, hold on a minute. Let me just call this up.
Because we also know that he met with John Lennon in Toronto, and,
That's
and
right,
they
he
had a
did.
connection,
That's right.
which Terry was,
1971,
you know.
yeah. I was there.
Okay, hold on a second. I will find out in a minute.
Is Terry in your novel?
No, Terry's definitely not in the But again, since she came.
That's good. That's a good.
She may be here. We'll find out right now.
If anybody has it, it's you. But if you don't have it, then it's not.
And yes.
Where's my $5?
I would guess, but
I didn't even remember, but I know.
I'll read this little section.
Do you know the author?
I know the author, yeah.
Anthony, this is in 1996, was a young filmmaker from New Jersey. He made a short movie about Marshall McLuhan. He had met as a student when McLuhan had been in residence at Fordham in the 1960s. So yes, so McLuhan does appear.
Bravo.
Question?
So, two comments and a question.
Go ahead.
First of all, I just want to compliment you as a rail fan that you got to mention all these different versions of our commuter trains. I just coincidentally was reading about it the other day, so I enjoyed that. I was going to criticize you for saying Grand Central Station at one point, but then you had to say correctly Grand Central Terminal, and a lot of New Yorkers do go back and forth, so that's okay. The second thing is, as you know, probably, but most of these other folks don't know, there's an award specifically for alternate history called the Sidewise Award, which I think this book is going to be a strong candidate for, and I say that as a past member of the judge panel. I had to stop when I became an editor, but maybe as I'm retiring, I'll get back into it. And I wanted to comment in relation to what you said earlier about writing about what's familiar. One of the paradoxes of alternate history is that you can write about any part of history you want to, but from a commercial point of view, or just a popularity point of view, if you write about something obscure, the whole trick of it fails for most readers because they won't recognize what's different and what's the same. To make an alternate history book work, it has to be familiar enough that you can have that little jerk of surprise each time something turns out to be different, and how it got to be different. That's the central thing about what makes it fun and what makes it science fiction, for that matter. So I mean, I think this is a great choice, because everybody knows about the Beatles, and everybody knows, even if they don't know about our great New York disc jockeys, and they will be able to appreciate what you're doing with it. So that's great. So, and my question is, are you sending the book to Paul and Ringo?
No, I mean, I could if I had an address. That's not a bad idea.
Well, they must have management.
All right. All right, good idea.
Apple still
Yeah.
uses Apple.
All right, I'll send it to them.
You should.
That's a very good idea. But listen, I have a couple of points
Send it
to
to
make.
Peter Jacks.
Yeah, this is Moshe Fader, who used to be, in effect, my co-editor at Tor Books, and he has a very incisive mind. And in response to one of your comments, the reason that it says terminal in there is 100% because of you. Because in one of my novels that you were reading, I talked about Grand Central Station, and when I got the manuscript back, I see, in those days it was paper, red circles every time, it was station. So, but Moshe is 100% right that the true name of the station
You know what I always say
is Grand
is
Central
that
Terminal.
Grand Central Station is a post office.
Yes, that's
And
right.
it's also a subway station, but it's
Yeah.
not the place where all those trains go. And what I tell people is who don't understand the difference between a station and a terminal, I say, think of the stations of the cross, right? The terminal is Golgotha, but you know, all the other places along the way, they're stations. And it's a terminal because you can't go any further. If the train tries to, it crashes into the bumper. So it's the end of the line.
Very
Unlike
gracious.
Penn Station,
Happy Easter.
you know, a genuine station.
But then there's the clock
What about the clock?
at Grand Central.
Do you believe in that myth that it's made
The
out
clock
of?
is of such importance to many people.
Yes.
Many people have met under the clock.
Yes, but and of course that phrase "under the clock" actually also refers to a famous clock in a hotel nearby that was built at the same time as Grand Central. But the thing about that clock, since you bring it up, is that there's this crazy urban myth that the clock is made out of precious opal. And there's even a guy who was an MTA PR guy who was spoken to in a documentary about Grand Central who says that it's worth millions of dollars because it's made out of real opal. No, it's not. It's made out of glass. It's called milk glass or opal glass. And there's no piece of opal in the world big enough to be that clock. So,
Not in this reality.
And a friend of mine.
Gotta go to the Fort Tunnels.
Not in this reality, right. So a friend of mine and I found out that people on Wikipedia were repeating this urban myth, and we started going.
But in your
there
reality,
regularly
what is it made
correcting
out
it.
of?
So-
What is the clock made out of?
In the alternate
In our reality or
yeah.
in the novel's
In
reality?
the novel's reality.
I don't know, I haven't thought about that, I don't talk about it. But maybe I'll put it into the
I
series.
found a picture to show people where they're taking the individual faces off, the clock has 4 faces, right? They're taking the faces off to clean them or something. And I point out, there's no armed guard standing by.
That's a very good point. By the way, I do want to say, though, thanks for mentioning the Sidewise Award. Again, the novel is an expansion of the short story, which is now the first chapter of the novel that I just read to you. So in addition to winning the Mary Shelley Award, it was a finalist, short form, for the Sidewise Award that most mentioned. But actually, apropos of your very good advice, I already sent the novel in to be considered, thank you. So you can go for it.
Yeah, there's no way of knowing, because we don't know what the books will be considered this year, but I
That's
think
true.
we definitely have a real shot.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? I mean, it's possible, I have a whole bunch of books here for anyone who wants one, but it's possible that if we keep on talking, they'll suddenly disappear. Polly?
What's your favorite Beatles album? I actually don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It's changed over the years. For a long time, it was Sgt. Pepper, but that was basically my own stupidity. It's because when I first heard the album, I didn't like it. And then I realized if I don't like a new Beatles album, it's not that the Beatles suddenly, are no longer making great music. It's that I'm not up to understanding it. So I listened to it a couple of times and then I came to love it. So for a very, very long time, it was my favorite album. But it's pretty much a tie between Revolver and Rubber Soul. And probably today it's Rubber Soul.
Those are my two favorites, Paul.
I was going to say, by the way, on Rubber Soul, one of the things about Rubber Soul, both albums have a lot of great songs, but there's a John Lennon song, It's Only Love, and one of the things that I found out about it is that Lennon hated that song. He didn't like the way his voice sounded. I think it's a great song, so I delight in, thinking that about the album. Yes.
Does this new Beatles song that came out recently give you a queasy feeling?
No, it didn't. It gave me both a happy and a sad feeling. But you'll be interested to know that was probably the last thing that I put into the novel, and because I wanted to make the novel as current as possible. And again, just to give you a slight preview, not giving anything away, in the novel there are at least 2 Beatle concerts that Pete attends. And in one of the Beatle concerts, I go over in both of them really, but in one especially, I go over very carefully the songs that the Beatles are performing. And one of the songs I mentioned is Now and Then. So, but I'm glad you asked that question, because I know we're not here to talk about AI, but since you raised the question by mentioning that song, in case anybody's interested, a lot of people criticize that recording as being AI because Paul McCartney made the mistake of saying, we used AI to do that. I have been in recording studios literally since 1962. That goes to show you, when I was just an infant. No, since 1962. And there never was a time that I was in a recording studio where something was recorded and then we and the engineer and the producer didn't go in and monkey around with the sound and raise the pitch here and bring in this and that. So yeah, in Thomas Edison's day, like if you hear Enrico Caruso singing like in you barely hear him because the recording quality was so poor, like in 1902 when that was recorded. But ever since modern times in the late 50s, and in particular Les Paul, who in the 1950s basically invented overdubbing and doing mixing with music, what we hear is the result of manipulation. It's not exactly how the singers sound. So the fact that they just use more modern techniques, in my view, in no way counts against that wonderful song. And it's heartbreaking. When I first heard it, I was, crying, and Pete felt the same way. Would have felt the same way about that as real life and real love. By the way, that also is true. The original title of Real Love was It's Real Life. I don't know if Rolling Stone had an article about it. I'm pretty sure they did at some point or mentioned it. Yeah, I thought that was a great song, and I was glad to hear it. And I don't accept that as the last Beatles song, however. I mean, McCartney's getting pretty much almost too old to sing, but he can still sing a little. There were George Harrison recordings that could be made into, Paul and Ringo could sing on them. And so I think that within a couple of years, we'll hear, some other new Beatles songs. And that, unfortunately or fortunately, will motivate me to write yet another. Any other questions or comments or insults? All right, listen, thank you very much. And